Good evening, everybody, and welcome. We are so delighted to be able to welcome you to this magnificent night, this virtual opportunity to chat with so many different members of the extraordinary faculty of the Medill School of Journalism as we continue to commemorate Medill Centennial and celebrate what is 100 years now of the best school of journalism in the world. And we are thrilled to be able to welcome you. My name is Mike Greenberg, and I was an undergrad at Medill. I graduated in 1989, and this is my wife, Stacy.
Hi, it's Stacy Stephanie Greenberg, and I graduated from IMC in '95.
And we are thrilled to have you here. And Medill was such an incredibly important part of both of our lives. I know, particularly with you, when you got out of IMC, the path that it enabled you to take through your career.
It really did. It really shaped my career. I graduated, as I said, in '95, and then I went on to work in marketing with Hyatt Hotels. I was there for a few years, and then I was recruited by Starwood Hotels, now Marriott. And I worked on various branding brands, and it was just really, I could reflect back on many of the skills in the classes that I took at IMC, and it really did shape my career. And now I'm currently a columnist for a luxury website. And my time at Medill was truly amazing.
In the meantime, I have spent about a quarter century now droning incessantly about sports on ESPN and representing as best I can what we like to call the Medill Mafia. I mean, quite simply, we are the sports media, led by Michael Wilbon and Christine Brennan. They are our leaders, and all the rest of us fall in line behind them. I have said many times, the weekend that our basketball team played in the NCAA tournament in Salt Lake City, I have no idea how ESPN stayed on the air. I really do not, because all of us were there. Michael Wilbon, Doug Collins, and I just basically held each other and cried watching that game. But the connections that we have formed through Northwestern and through Medill are actually more personal even than they are professional. There was a day in 1995 that I was in a restaurant and I walked by a table and a friend of mine was sitting with this most beautiful woman I'd ever seen in my entire life. And he said, Mike, this is Stacy. She's going to Northwestern. Stacy, Mike went to Northwestern, and here we are 25 years and 2 children later. All things are going quite well. And speaking of those 2 children,
our daughter Nikki is a sophomore currently at Northwestern and loving life and happy to be on campus and running around outside at the lakefront and being at Norris Center. And our son is a senior in high school, and we are proud to say that he will be starting Northwestern in the fall.
So it really is a family affair now,
really
in every conceivable way. And this is such an important part of our lives in so many different ways. And we have been fortunate enough thus as a result to be back on campus a lot, visiting our daughter, coming back for sporting events and all those sorts of things. And what I would say as I reflect on my time there in the 80s and just looking at some notes I jotted down as I spoke about this at an event in New York a couple of years ago, that the difference in the campus, just to begin with, is profound. I went to a lovely little school by a lake. And when you see what the campus has become now, when you see the way the university has been transformed, and in particular when it comes to our world of sports, for any of you who have seen the new athletic facility, the Walter Athletic Facility, Pete Thamel, who has been covering collegiate sports at the very highest levels for Sports Illustrated and others, called it the best football facility in the country. And there is literally no one in the world who ever would have believed that Northwestern University could have that, except for the people on this Zoom. And that's why it is so important that any and all of us who have the ability to do so support the university in general and support Medill in particular. The work that we do that is being done at Medill is critical and vital, and never more so than it is right now. And several years ago, Stacy and I, we created our endowed scholarship there. Because at the risk of getting political, which we will not do, that does not feel to us as though there has ever been a time when it was more vital and important to have journalists being trained at the Medill School of Journalism than it is now. So with that, it is our great privilege tonight to introduce Dean Whitaker. Hopefully most of you already know Charles Whitaker. He is the first alum in the now 100-year history of the Medill School of Journalism to become the dean. He has a bachelor's from Medill. He has a master's from Medill. He had an extraordinarily distinguished career at Ebony and many other places in the interim before he came back, and now again has been the dean for the last several years, has become a dear friend, and has managed with an extremely steady hand what has been the most challenging year that I can imagine any of us ever had. So with that, Charles, we will turn it over to you. Thank you all so very much for joining tonight, and I hope you enjoy the program as much as we will.
Mike and Stacy, thank you so much. We really appreciate all that you do for Medill, for Northwestern, and for me personally. You really are dear friends. You're Wildcats through and through, and I can't tell you how much we appreciate your support. And congratulations to Stephen for joining the Wildcat fold and becoming a part of the class of 2025. To our guests, yes. And happy birthday, Stacy.
Oh, thank you.
Well, I forgot to mention that. Most importantly,
Charles.
I forgot to mention, I will always remember the day that the world came to an end last year. I will always remember that it was March 11th because it was my wife's birthday.
Well, there are more fond memories of March 11. And again,
It wasn't the best March 11th we've ever had. Hopefully this will be.
yes, absolutely. Well, enjoy your birthday, and thank you both. We really appreciate it. To our guests on this webinar, I welcome you and thank you for joining us for this, the second event in our year-long celebration of the 100th anniversary of the founding of Medill. Last month on February 8th, which is the actual date of our founding, we had a really fun Zoom trivia night that included guest appearances by President Shapiro and Provost Haggerty and featured questions about our storied past. Tonight, with the assistance of several of my esteemed colleagues, we want to have a conversation that focuses a bit on the future of Medill, as well as the future of the industries we serve. Before we get started, I must, as we do at the beginning of all Northwestern events, acknowledge that the Northwestern campus sits on the traditional homelands of the people of the Council of Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, and Ottawa, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. We respect and honor that past. Now is onto the present and the topics at hand. This, as everyone knows, is a tumultuous time in the world and in the world of media, marketing, and communications. So what we want to do tonight is talk a bit about how Medill is facing some of those challenges and preparing our students to enter and navigate this fraught landscape. We also want to discuss some of our plans for leading the way into the future. As I've often said in many of the forums that I enter, it's no longer enough for a great journalism and marketing communications school simply to prepare and train the next generation of professionals and leaders in these fields. We have to come down from the ivory tower, roll our sleeves up, and help chart a course out of this maelstrom. And to do that, I have a wonderful group of colleagues who are helping to chart that course. Tonight, we'll talk for about 40 minutes about what's happening in and outside of Medill, and then I'll turn to the Q&A box to answer any questions that may come from you, our audience. So if you have questions, feel free to click the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen and submit them there, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible during the time that we have. Now, allow me to introduce my colleagues, and I will do so in alphabetical order because I'm not sure what order they're actually appearing on your screens. We'll start with the newest member of our faculty, Assistant Professor Danielle Robinson Bell, who just joined us in September and teaches in the Integrated Marketing Communications program. Professor Bell's area of expertise is strategic communications and its impact on business outcomes for organizations, brands, and executives. She specializes in work that advances efforts related to culture, equity, inclusion, women, and people of color in the workplace. Prior to joining Medill, Professor Bell spent more than 15 years on the agency side of advertising and branding, created integrated marketing campaigns for some of the world's most recognized brands. In addition to her faculty role, she advises brands, businesses, and executives on communications matters such as crisis communications, reputation management, public relations, and inclusive communications. But coming to Medill to teach is something of a homecoming for Professor Bell because she's a double alumna of Northwestern. She holds an undergraduate degree from Medill and an MBA from Kellogg. Next, we have Professor Christopher Benson, who in addition to teaching in Medill is a Chicago-based journalist and lawyer. Prior to entering the academy and going to law school, Professor Benson was features editor and Washington editor for Ebony magazine, where we met in another lifetime ago. And he's written for a host of publications, including Chicago, Savoy, and the Crisis magazines, the Chicago Tribune, the Chicago Sun-Times, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and Reader's Digest. He contributed commentary to the Huffington Post and has written an award-winning weekly column on race and social justice in media for the Chicago Reporter. He was associate producer and co-writer of the Emmy Award-winning WTTW documentary Paper Trail, 100 Years of the Chicago Defender, and he's co-author with Mamie Till Mobley of her memoir, Death of Innocence, the story of the hate crime that changed America, about the life and brutal lynching of Mrs. Till Mobley's son, Emmett Till. That book has received many honors, including a 2003 Robert F. Kennedy Book Award given by the Robert F. Kennedy Center for Justice and Human Rights. Professor Benson received his bachelor's and master's degrees in journalism from the University of Illinois and his law degree from Georgetown University. At Medill, he teaches courses on media law and ethics, magazine writing, and new courses he developed on media and the marginalized and racialized propaganda. Next, we have Associate Professor Debbie Sensiber, who's director of the Medill Investigative Lab, and a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter and nonfiction author who writes for the Washington Post. In addition to her Pulitzer, Professor Sensiber has won dozens of awards in American print journalism, including the Robert F. Kennedy Award and the Goldsmith Prize for Investigative Reporting from Harvard University. Professor Sensiber received the Pulitzer at the Miami Herald for stories about affordable housing developers who were stealing from the poor. She also was a Pulitzer finalist in explanatory reporting for reports that chronicled widespread breakdowns in government's multi-billion-dollar hurricane warning system. At the Post, she's recorded on local nonprofit groups that fail to provide services for people with AIDS and the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development's troubled housing construction program for the poor, which led to changes in federal law. Last year, Professor Sensiber spent much of the pandemic working along Medill students to write about the devastating impact that COVID-19 has had on America's nursing homes, and it is fantastic work. I encourage you, if you have a chance to do so, go to the Washington Post and check out those stories. They did more than a dozen major investigative stories, all of which were published in the Post. Professor Sensiber's first nonfiction book, Love Wins, The Lovers and Lawyers Who Fought the Landmark Case for Marriage Equality, was named one of the most notable books of 2016 by the Washington Post. Her second nonfiction book, Citizen 865, The Hunt for Hitler's Hidden Soldiers in America, was published by Hachette in November 2019. Now we have Senior Associate Dean Tim Franklin, who is the occupant of our newest endowed chair, the John M. Mutz Chair in Local News. Dean Franklin is the leader of the Medill Local News Initiative, a 3-year-old research and development project to help bolster the sustainability of local news. He's the former president of the Poynter Institute, an international school for journalists and a media think tank. He's also served as the top editor of several venerable newspapers, including the Indianapolis Star, the Orlando Sentinel, and the Baltimore Sun, and managing editor for Bloomberg News in Washington, D.C. He was a reporter and senior editor at the Chicago Tribune for 17 years, eventually rising to become an associate managing editor overseeing the sports and business sections. Dean Franklin was the founding director of the National Sports Journalism Center at Indiana University and has served twice as a Pulitzer Prize judge. He has been a national leader in freedom of information issues, serving as co-chair of the American Society of Newspaper Editors Freedom of Information Committee for 5 years, and on the board of directors of the National Freedom of Information Coalition. He now serves on the board of the Illinois Better Government Association, and in 2012, he was selected as a distinguished alumni recipient at his alma mater, the Indiana University Media School. Last, but certainly not least, we have Professor Jeremy Gilbert, who is both an old and new member of the Medill faculty. In September, Professor Gilbert, who taught at Medill several years ago before going back into industry, returned to the fold at Medill to assume the Knight Chair in Digital Media Strategy. Both his work and teaching focus on the content and revenue strategies of existing and emerging media companies. He explores the intersection of technology and media, examining how new tools and techniques will affect the creation, consumption, and distribution of media. Professor Gilbert also oversees the Medill Knight Lab, a community of designers, developers, students, and educators working on experiments designed to push journalism into new spaces. Prior to assuming the Knight Chair, Professor Gilbert was the Washington Post's Director of Strategic Initiatives, where he led an award-winning team that transformed the Post into an international digital-first news organization. The team collaborated closely with the Post engineering, product design, graphics, analytics, and revenue teams by identifying, creating, and executing unique digital products and storytelling methods. Professor Gilbert experimented with a new form of presentation of 2016's presidential election results by using 3D printers. He also launched the Post's first machine-generated, fully automated AI created stories to cover elections and the Olympics. He created the Post's first augmented and virtual reality projects, including one shown at the Tribeca Film Festival. His past roles include developing a digital strategy for National Geographic. He also taught media product design, interactive storytelling, web and print design tools and techniques as associate professor at Medill and the Siegel Design Institute. He led the Poynter Institute in rethinking and redesigning its industry-leading website and served as the art director for the Tampa Bay Times and the News Press. And like Professor Bell, Professor Gilbert also is a Medill alumnus, having earned both his bachelor's and master's degrees here. Thank you, colleagues, for joining us. Thank you, our attendees. I wanted to give you a sense of how, sorry if I went on a bit long with those bios, but I wanted to give you a sense of how amazing these people are. It's such an honor for me to work with them every day. I feel unworthy being in their presence, but they really do make my job a joy. I know we're going to talk about the future, but I think it's probably important for us to talk a little bit about the present. And I wanted those of you who are teaching and have been teaching through the pandemic to talk a little bit about how your classes have been going and how your students have been doing and how you've had to rethink teaching at this moment in time. I don't know if anyone wants to start. Actually, Debbie, I'm going to start with you because you're the first person up on my screen.
Sure. Thanks, Charles, and welcome everybody. I run a program called the Medill Investigative Lab, where students work directly with me on investigations. And our goal is to publish in major media outlets like the Washington Post. So when the pandemic really struck last March, we were 3 months into a project on immigration policies. And our students quickly pivoted. We saw a need to write about COVID-19 deaths in nursing homes. And over spring break, my students volunteered to work on that very first story. And that turned into a run of well over 15, maybe 20 stories from April through December 31st in the Washington Post. We published our last investigation at 6 o'clock on New Year's Eve in the Post. And what was amazing about it is it was all done remotely. We were able to do all of our reporting over the phone. We looked at documents, data, and students were absolutely unbelievable. Their flexibility, the ability to pivot, to leave a project behind that they were excited about and move into this new project. It was just an incredible thing to watch them. In fact, I remember being on the phone when our first story published in the Washington Post on the front page, and this news alert went out that, breaking news about our story, and 2 of my students saw it on their phone and they went, oh my gosh. And it was so incredible for me as a journalist of 25 plus years to just hear that passion and excitement in these young people. And what was amazing about it was that I worked with these students for months and never met them. I mean, it was like, they knew my dog's names, my kids' names, my husband's name, and I never met these students. They were able to do it all remotely, and I was really proud of them. So their ability to pivot was really just stunning.
So much of what we do when we talk about reporting, we talk about shoe leather reporting, sort of being out there and seeing people and capturing detail. How did you compensate for that? And how did your students compensate for that in remote reporting?
Yeah, and that was a challenge. Fortunately, we were doing investigative reporting as opposed to feature writing, where we would really want to embed with the people we write about, right? But I really spent a lot of time teaching them about interviewing skills, how to tease out details over the phone. Don't just tell me someone went to the movies. I want to know, what were they eating and what movie was it and what were they thinking at the time? And so we spent a lot of time talking about interviewing strategies and how to tease out those details that bring characters to life, that show, you know, the humanity that we're trying to describe. And so that's how we were able to do it. It wasn't easy, but I'll tell you, at the end of this project, my students published 51 obituaries in the Washington Post. One obituary for a senior citizen who died in a nursing home in all 50 states in the District of Columbia. They were able to talk about their families, their dogs, name the dogs. And they were really able to write about that in a very beautiful and colorful way. In fact, students were so excited about this that with the help of some unexpected donor funding, we were able to keep them on over the summer and pay them to be interns and fellows. And they stayed on throughout. They were really excited about this work.
That's true. We were very concerned because internships had dried up as a result of the pandemic. And we were fortunate enough to get funding from many donors to enable us to kind of step in and take the place of those internships and keep those students on and keep them employed over the summer. Yeah,
that's right. They needed the resume line, and they were just passionate about this project. In fact, some students stayed on even after those internships ended. One was brought on contract at the Washington Post. He was so essential in the work that we were doing. So I really ended up working with students throughout, right up until 6 o'clock on New Year's Eve, 2020.
Danielle, what was it like for you? You were coming straight out of industry. We plop you into the classroom, and you've got to not only learn to teach, but you've got to learn to teach remote. What was that like?
Yeah, I've commented several times that what a time to start a career in academia. But I gotta say, as a comms professional, a lot of my work is about how to connect with people, right? How to do that through various channels. And so I really tapped into that for myself as an instructor. And it was a bit of, now it's time for me to practice what I preach. So I took knowing that, I took a page out of my own teaching philosophy, which is just quite simply beyond the classroom, right? I try to bring things into the syllabus and into the learning that they can look around in their own worlds and draw parallels to. And so I just kept that in mind. And so two things, I would start every class with a bit of not Q&A, question of the day, if you will, and had nothing to do with the topic of the week. And that went over well. And then I also looked around us and pulled in material from headlines that were and current events that were unfolding as we were making our way through the quarter. So one of my favorite sort of wonderful ways this all synced up for me this past quarter was when we got to our module on investor relations. And it happened to be the same week that the GameStop Reddit Robinhood fiasco was unfolding, and it just made the learning that much more rich. And so I'm told students have shared with me that this has gone over very well, and is a bit of a example of that. You can see I'm in my office here tonight. I spend a lot of time here. I spend time here, especially when I'm teaching, because it's a distraction-free environment for me. But on the day just earlier this week, when it was warm and everyone was outside, I took my computer and I sat. There are tables outside of the McCormick Center, and I'm just sitting there, preparing for class, and I hear, "Professor Bell." And I turn around, and masks and everything. It was a student, and we had the warmest conversation for a few minutes. You would have thought that we'd known each other a very long time. You would have thought that we'd seen each other before, and I reflected on that moment as, wow, even one, recognizing me from, on campus, but then two, the interaction felt familiar. Right. And so I said, okay, I must have I think something went right here with being able to connect with the students in the classroom.
Chris, so much of I've seen you in the classroom and sort of watch you sort of command the room, but also engage with students, even in a large classroom. You're very good at getting every student kind of involved in the discussion. How did you do that over Zoom? And at this moment in time, what were you able to bring in the class into the classroom to spark those conversations?
Yeah, it was a challenge. There's no question about it. The courses I teach are in the suite of new courses you teased out. And so it's subject matter that really excites the students. They're self-selecting courses. The students are there because they want to be there. As I mentioned, they're oversubscribed. We have a wait list. You can imagine with titles like fake news, racialized propaganda, and framed media and the marginalized, that would attract a lot of student attention. I'm happy to say that they come prepared for the discourse. The readings are accessible. A lot of material that's pulled from clearly some of the theoretical offerings from different writers, but also newspaper articles, magazine articles. And so as we heard before, Danielle mentioned, we start with headlines. And so the headlines become icebreakers. And as I told the students, as I tell them every term, it's likely that the news is going to drive our discussion. And I don't know whether this is fortunate or unfortunate, but that is true in the area of racial justice, that there has been so much in the news that has reflected and anticipated the discussions that we've had. So they come ready to take on this material. And what I love about Medill's students is that they are really eager. Not only to master the skills that are necessary to tell the stories, but the concepts in courses such as the ones I teach, to understand the environment in which they're working. So we spend a lot of time dealing with framework, with understanding social construction, for example, developing a vocabulary for them to deal with the issues they see unfold every day. So yeah, it's not like I can walk around the classroom and engage and stop people from using their social media, but we find new ways to do that. And I have to say, a shout out to our IT people at Medill, who have been tremendous, not only in supporting, but in guiding us through a lot of the instructionals on things that we can do with this environment that we're working in. And then the university itself shared with us a lot of teaching techniques. So I was able to use a lot of innovative measures in the classroom. So we have breakout sessions. They get together in smaller groups. So we have like more than 40 students in my classes. They get together in smaller groups where they can interact, where they're encouraged to speak more than they might be encouraged to do in larger settings, and come back and we do sort of what they call a jigsaw, where one group deals with one element of an overarching problem, and then we build and build and build until the final conclusion. They can see how it all comes together. So it's important with respect to framing their understanding, but it also, I think, lends a lot to their storytelling because they can see it unfolding right there in the classroom. And they also see the relevance of what we're dealing with. So not to get partisan on this, but we've had a very interesting and challenging period that has I think heightened their understanding of the responsibility of journalism.
Jeremy, what was it like for you stepping back in the classroom, having been away, and coming back to this moment in time? You're muted.
Sorry. If Mike Greenberg hadn't done it first, I'd feel worse. No, it's very interesting because in a way, my work is very much in the space of technology and the intersection of technology and media. So from that standpoint, I expect my students to be very comfortable with digital tools, very comfortable with digital communications. On the other hand, part of what makes working at Medill very special for me is that the Night Lab is a physical space. And when campus reopens, I really encourage and invite all of you to come and see the physical lab, because it is a space that is meant to help the students really think creatively and think very differently. And in ways that Professor Benson was mentioning, sort of step aside from their digital devices and think about technology creatively without necessarily employing technology. So the irony is we were doing this teaching around technology, but we were doing it with as little technology as possible, as much time spent with Post-it notes and building paper prototypes and talking to people about digital innovations. And so it's been very interesting to try to take that model of hands-on learning and apply it in a digital environment. And so, there are some things that are certainly more challenging, but there have been other things that are really great. One of the things we used to do outside of class time is invite the students to come and play board games that involve teamwork and collaboration. And so, for example, we had them play games on Twitch outside of class time. And so they were having a live streamed board game experience all on Twitch. The other thing that has been great is that we've really used digital tools to allow students who might not otherwise have been able to collaborate. So we have students across about a dozen different time zones in one of the classes, and they're all working on Slack and they're all communicating over Zoom. And so we can do some things that way that otherwise wouldn't be possible and really bring different perspectives into the classroom because of what their home environments are like. So there are some very strong positives.
Let's tilt forward a little bit, Tim. Much of the news about what's happening to the business model in media is bad. We are losing newspapers. There are news deserts all around the country. What should we be hopeful about? And how's the local news initiative trying to address that?
Thanks, Charles, and hello to everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. Talking about crises and the pandemic and what it's done, the pandemic has put the local news crisis on steroids. It's ironic because last year there was this paradox where local news was maybe never more important than it's been in a century. Our readership of local news sites doubled last year. Digital subscriptions were up 80%. There was this hunger and thirst for local news all over the country at the same time that the advertising that was an underpinning of local news cratered. So you had this dichotomy that was going on with a crumbling business model. At the same time, there was a surge for news that's so vital at the time of a public health crisis. Happily, with your support and with the support of foundations and some companies and individual donors, Medill's been able to roll up its sleeves and really work with news organizations on this problem. The biggest news companies in the country, local news leaders around the country. And this is one of those things that could only happen at Medill. You have the expertise of audience insights and analytics and IMC. You have a place like Jeremy was talking about at the Night Lab, which produces digital tools and is on the cutting edge of new technology. And so we're bringing those forces together to really get into the gears of local news organizations to help them create a new business model for the future. And it's invigorating, as maybe you can tell from my fast-paced talking, but it's really invigorating to work with so many experts and to work with so many people who are so passionate about this. And this is a big existential problem that we're talking about. And I think some schools would probably walk away from it and say, you know what, this is too big for us. And I'm really proud that here we've taken the opposite approach. And we've said, this is a big existential problem. We're going to dig in and we're going to help solve it.
Is it fixable?
That's a great question. Speaking of existential questions, I think that the answer is yes. In what form that will be, I think it's too early to tell. I can talk more about this later in great detail, but one of the things we're working on is helping news organizations pivot from that advertising business model that collapsed to a reader revenue business model, digital subscriptions, memberships, and so forth. And we're seeing some promise around the country, including with some of the news organizations that we've been working with that have really been able to grow their digital subscribers. That may be one solution, but there may be many others, some of them technology-based. Some argue that we may be headed toward a civic era of local news, in which local news is largely supported by philanthropy and memberships and individual donors. I think it's too early to tell, but look, we're at a historic crossroads. We're at a moment in time, and Medill is right at the center of trying to help figure this out, and that's exciting. It's daunting, but it's also exciting.
Speaking of an existential crisis, there are already questions in the Q&A about the politicization of news, the sort of balkanization of it, the belief that, you know, all news is partisan now, that all news people are injecting their opinion into stories, that we're not just that news is not just the facts anymore, and commingled with that is the notion of not only is it not just the facts, a lot of it is just fake. And I get asked all the time, what is Medill doing about that? You know, how are you teaching? You know, what are you teaching about that? And Debbie and Chris, you both teach skills classes, and Jeremy, feel free to weigh in on this as well. But what is your take? What are you saying to students, and what is your take on the way we are approaching sort of traditional news values, if you will?
I talk to my students all the time about, you know, it's the fundamentals, in my opinion. It's, you have to be accurate, you have to be fair. And as long as you are accurate and fair, and you can write with authority, I try to kind of, for me personally, try to drown out a little bit of that noise. And so, you know, in the case of the nursing home coverage we wrote last year, we were focusing on for-profit nursing homes that were not providing care to people during this crisis, right? And we wrote about government regulators that failed to police this for-profit industry. And as long as we did that in a fair and balanced way, I really do think readers ultimately respond to that and can kind of get past that noise.
We say that we do this in a fair and balanced way, and the public just doesn't believe it. Right? They just absolutely mistrust us. We can say it till we're blue in the face, and they still think that we are partisan. Is there something we could or should be doing to address that?
That is one of those existential questions that is a very hard one to answer. I know Marty Barron, the executive editor at the Post, when all of this was going on, fake news, it was keep your eye on the ball, right? We're just doing our jobs the way we know how to do it. It's a tough thing. And part of me believes that there will be, you know, some people who will never believe what we write, no matter how many documents we have, and no matter how much our work is supported by facts.
That is an existential threat. I mean, that is a threat to democracy, if you will, if they don't believe us and they don't think that we are fair and balanced, and they choose to believe other sources that confirm their beliefs, whether it's true or not. That's tough. That makes the country tough to govern. Chris, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, well, you know, we've talked a lot about racial reckoning right now. We're sorting out a lot of issues nationally. It's also a time of media reckoning, in my view. And we see this starting out in this social justice context. We see it with the sorting out at the LA Times, the Kansas City Star now, and New York Times, and others we probably haven't heard about. But to me, that opens the door to something much larger, and that is an opportunity now to step back and look at ourselves critically. What is it we're doing that works? What is it that we're doing that doesn't work? And I think it was the New York Times some time ago posed the question, how do you, and this is again getting very close to partisan comment, but how do you adjust in a free and responsible press to cover an authoritarian regime? So I think what people are perceiving is perhaps in some cases a frustration with being used as a platform for administration messaging, we'll call it that, by this slavish devotion to objectivity and not questioning. We're advancing sometimes a message that is not objective. And so then there's a pushback that makes it look like we're being partisan, when in fact what we're doing is our job. We're questioning certain things that are questionable. But I think it's a moment in which we should step back and take a critical look at ourselves and decide how we want to come out with respect to our fundamental traditional values, and that is truth-seeking values, and as Debbie said, you know, fairness, accuracy, balance, but also context, because I don't think we do enough to convey meaning to the public. But there are all different levels of journalism, right? There's news reporting, there's analysis, there's explanatory journalism, there's investigative journalism, enterprise journalism, there's commentary. And I think what we need to do is to think about—
We get that, but the public does not get that at all. They don't understand.
We also have to do a better job of advancing the goals of media literacy. Now, there are going to be some people you'll never get back, right? There's this thing called confirmation bias, and they're going to look for the sources that don't challenge them, but only reinforce their views. And so to the extent that we may raise questions that appear to question their views, there's pushback. And so fake news is awfully convenient, and we know how that was used against us. But I really believe this is a time for critical self-assessment. Other people have teased that out. Debbie mentioned Marty Baron. He mentioned in one of his exit interviews that, you know, we've been sort of doing this on the fly because we've been responding to, you know, to the exigencies of the moment. But we need a critical self-assessment that I think Medill really can guide. And you know that I've been talking up this this initiative whereby we can get together with all the talent that we have, all the intellectual power that we have, all the professional experience that we have, and help to guide this conversation with respect to our professional peers.
Jeremy, is there a digital solution that will help regain the trust of the public? I mean, you know, trust in media is at an all-time low. Is there something that we could do that would say to the public digitally, that would say to the public, you know, this has been fact-checked? Is there some seal of approval that we can stamp on stories in order to regain trust?
I wish that there was one technology that would obviously solve all these problems. And of course there isn't. But I think there are a number of really interesting efforts and experiments that are doing a couple of different things. One, that are trying to create a schema around fact checking. So this is something that Google and several universities, including Medill, including some efforts from us, to try to say, what is an actual fact check? Because one of our colleagues looked extensively. One of the things that might surprise some people is that there are people, especially on the extreme right, who use the phrase fact checking to mean something entirely different. Yeah. So can we codify what it means to be a fact check? And can we make those fact checks much more available so that when you are on social media, much more rapidly, we can actually fact check the things that you were seeing. So instead of a piece of news that is fake circulating widely and then later being fact checked, well, we can apply a fact check or at least a label of some kind that indicates that this isn't true. But there are other things that we can do too. And I think one of the challenges is that partisanship can be conscious and also subconscious. And so, for example, one of the things that my students are working on currently in one of my classes is that we are looking at subconscious linguistic bias or partisan word choice. And so what they're doing is we're using machine learning. We're looking at tens of thousands of articles that have been categorized as deliberately opinion writing. So opinion writing that is characterized as on the left and opinion writing on the right. And what we're doing is we're building a dictionary of terms. So we're taking all the words that both, you know, for example, if you're writing about gun control or you're writing about opinions and you about immigration, you take all the words that those two articles, one from the right and one from the left, have in common, you throw them out. And you say, okay, what are words that signal to the left their stance about immigration or their stance about gun control? And what are words on the right that do the same? And then we can say within a news article, one that's meant to be objective, are we seeing those left or right leaning words? Because it may be that the writers of those articles are intending to be as objective and nonpartisan as possible, but that because in their own media consumption, they're hearing these phrases, they're hearing these words and not understanding that they sort of tip left or tip right. And so the whole idea of the system that we're trying to build is, can we alert you as you start to write about gun control to say, if you use this phrase or that phrase, it's going to have meaning that your audience might apply that you're not. And so I do think, well, it's not a perfect solution. There are a number of different things we can do. So one is we can try to help prepare journalists using these technology tools. Two, we can try to work with the technology partners like Google and like Facebook and say, let's surface correct information when it's available. And three, we also have to find tools that will help us combat misinformation directly. So whether it's something like a deep fake or something that is maybe less malicious, but a synthetic piece of media that's not real, we need to build detectors, which we can do, that will alert journalists and alert the public when we see these kinds of things. So I think there are some possibilities. None of them are perfect, but progress is being made.
Danielle?
You know what, I'd like to respond to that. Because I think that's vitally important as we move forward in considering ways that we can help to enlighten the public and not bias one way or the other. One of the examples, I have many that I share with students in my classes, the semantic differential, right? Our word choice, which is what you just touched on, and the meaning of certain words. I mean, I can use to describe the same smell, I can say it's a stench or an aroma, and that's going to create your reality of that thing, right? In a real world situation, reverse discrimination is a term we often like to use in the media. Well, I can tell you as a lawyer, as a person who spent my first year in law school at EEOC, there is no such thing as reverse discrimination. So what does that term do but inflame passions? It does not inform. If you are white and you feel you've been discriminated against, you file a claim on racial discrimination, period. So there are a whole list of terms that we use, Jeremy, that I think tend to bias the public and ultimately misinform. And isn't that exactly the opposite of what we should be doing? So I'd love to have a deeper conversation with you about this. And this is one of the things I miss about this lockdown, is that you don't run into colleagues in the hallways. So let's try to make a point of it. I'd love to do that.
Danielle, are there things that journalism can learn from IMC and from our IMC colleagues to sort of, again, we are in reputational crisis right now. And your expertise is crisis communications, right? So how can we apply, or what and we've seen, in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd, some brands that were very effective at communicating to their audiences, not just virtue signaling, but actually signaling that they were of the moment and in the moment.
Mm-hmm. So, yes. So it's funny, as I was listening to you all talk, I said, wow, it sounds like journalism needs some marketing help, or needs some crisis communications help. Exactly what I was thinking as you all were talking. But from the marketing side of things, from the lens of brands and organizations, I can't think of a time when brands have looked more inward, right? And organizations look more inward in terms of what they want to stand for, who they want to be, who they need to be. The brands and organizations who, for lack of a better term, got it right in the aftermath of George Floyd were the ones who did it in a way that was authentic to who they are, but also, and I explained this to my students this past quarter, I don't think we should be naive in thinking that these statements that we saw flying after George Floyd were done for anything but the bottom line, right? So there was a lot of, okay, I'm going to make a statement, but let's nitpick these words so that we still keep our consumer base, so that we don't upset the investors, so that Wall Street doesn't come calling. You have to really understand, while it looked good, while it sounded good, a lot of these organizations and brands were sort of, like you said, we're just responding in the moment. The sweet spot, though, and the ones who really got it right were the ones who, there are two adages. There's this, let's meet your audience where they are. And then there's another adage that says, meet the moment. And I like to say the sweet spot is when you meet your audience where they are in the moment. And that's where I think brands and organizations tend to miss the mark there. I am very excited to have developed and be bringing to IMC a course called Culture and Inclusion in Marketing. And it's in large part because it's needed. And when you think about the next generation of marketing practitioners, I think Medill has a responsibility to make sure that no one falls down on the job when it comes to being inclusive and connecting with audiences and doing so in a way that is meaningful and authentic. You don't want that when I was told that a student who found out about the course got excited about it and said that no Medill grad should be responsible for a PR and marketing disaster because they didn't know better, right? And as an alum, that really resonated with me, and it's so true. And so I'm excited to bring, that coursework to the IMC group, and I think there, I don't know where the synergies might be with journalism and with news, but I know that whereas there used to be this saying around consumer is king and content is king. I'm sure we've all heard that before. And I think while that's still very true, I think it's time that we turn the lens on culture and connection and and elevating that and teaching, how do we nail that? How do we get students in marketing and future marketing practitioners to champion culture and inclusion in the workplace, and to be able to engage with those efforts in a way in which they feel confident and knowledgeable and familiar with it.
You touch on things that are a good segue to Tim and something we're working on called the Subscriber Engagement Index. And that's sort of connection to audience, understanding kind of who they are and what they want in order to get them, with the ultimate goal of getting them to pay for it, frankly. Tim, can you tell us a little bit more about that, and how does that connect with sort of, building confidence, but also building more engagement with the readers?
Yeah, sure. One thing about this time that we're living in that gives me hope is that we just came out of this period where there was a premium on clicks and page views, because that was driving programmatic advertising revenue. So in some ways, news organizations were incented to do things that would draw audience, that would be sensational, that would be clickbait. In the new model, it's really about quality, and it's really about getting people to pay for the product that you're producing. And so I think there's going to be a flight back to quality, because in a reader revenue model, you need people to give you their credit card so they'll pay you for your news and information. It's as old as capitalism itself. You have to make a product worth paying for. So that really puts what we're doing with the Subscriber Engagement Index kind of right at the center of this whole shift.
Say what that
reader
is.
revenue.
Explain what the Subscriber Engagement Index is.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've been working at the Local News Initiative with the Spiegel Research Center at Medill, and we were awarded a Google Innovation Grant about 18 months ago to build the Subscriber Engagement Index. So what it will do is that our data scientists, our experts, will be able to carefully track the behaviors of individual subscribers and eventually members. Why is that important? Because you need to understand the behaviors of your paying customers and why people are paying for news, and in some cases, why they stop paying for news. The Subscriber Engagement Index will include literally hundreds of local news organizations around the country. We're soft launching later this month. It'll be fully operational in the spring. We have all the major media companies in the country are now participating in this. Around 400 or so publications around the country. And this is another one of those only at Medill kind of things, because local news organizations are not going to be turning over their data to just anybody. They trust Medill, they trust Northwestern with their data, and we're Switzerland. So we're going to be able to collect all this data, and then news organizations will be able to benchmark their own performance against their peers across the country, across this whole wide array of metrics in real time. It's really extraordinary. This is nobody's built anything like this before. And because of the generosity of foundations and companies and donors, we're making this free in the first year to news organizations, many of which are cash strapped and may not be able to afford something like this. So, and in addition to the impact I think this could have on local news outlets, This also is going to be an absolute treasure trove of research data for Medill, because we're going to have all of this audience data from across the country, and it will allow us to stay on top of trends that are happening in the industry that really no other school in the country will be able to do.
Shifting gears a little bit, Debbie, investigative reporting is more important. I won't say it's more important today than it's ever been, but it certainly is important. Students are clamoring to do it. We have better tools for investigative reporting than we ever had before for data mining and data analysis. But what I worry about is that as many local newspapers, the Miami Herald is a shadow of its former self. Not that it's not doing good work still, but it is a shadow of, we are both Miami Herald alums, and we were both there in the glory days of the Miami Herald. But it is not the paper that we worked for when we worked there many years ago. And I worry that, these amazing investigative reporters that we are turning out will have no place to go. What is the future of investigative reporting? Where are these students going these amazing reporters that we are turning out?
Yeah, I really think, as you said, that there's such an interest now, really. I mean, after Watergate, there was a huge interest in investigative reporting among young people, right? I really feel like we're seeing that again now. And in fact, the project we're working on now in the Medill Investigative Lab is just so important and so relevant. We're working on a project that touches on the rise in white nationalism and extremism. And I have students that want to immediately go out and cover rallies and do this and do that. I mean, the passion is there and the skills are there. But I do think there are news outlets that we can place students in. A number of students in my last Medill Investigative Lab class got jobs right out of graduate school. One's in Pittsburgh at Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Tim helped get a job, although she did it on her own in Chicago, in an investigative outlet in Chicago. So there are jobs, but you're right, Charles. I mean, we've been worried for years about regional newspapers and community newspapers downsizing, and it's a problem. And I just hope that nonprofit investigative news outlets can help pick up the slack. ProPublica and other places can help pick up the slack. And, major newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post are really, really ramping up their investigative staffs, because these are the stories that readers respond to. These are the stories that readers appreciate. When we can follow the money and hold people accountable for their decisions, we really can drum up a lot of readers that way. And that's what we do. That's what we're trying to do.
Tim, Jeremy, Chris, either or all of you can weigh in on this. Australia went to battle with Google over advertising, and they did reach some détente, some compromise there. But to what extent should we, and I shudder to say this because we actually get some support from Google. I don't want to say that we're aiming our swords at Google and the search engines and Facebook, but to what extent, do we have to face the devastation, for lack of a better word, that has wrought on media? And again, what do we do about that? What do we do to combat that? Is there anything we can do to combat that? And again, what should we as a journalism school be doing to address that? Jeremy?
I mean, Charles, I don't mean to suggest that Google and Facebook haven't had tremendous impact on the news industry, but I think some of the challenge is, and Tim talked a little bit about this before, that the core of the relationship had broken down a little bit. And Danielle probably knows this, better than a journalist like me would, but that when we were creating news and information as journalists that was so compelling, our readers were willing to support it.
Yeah.
As we moved more and more toward a differentiated revenue model, and this is decades ago, that was driven by advertising, that compact broke down a little bit. It's not to say that we weren't producing tremendous and high quality important journalism, but the relationship between what people thought they were paying for and what was really being produced broke down. And so in some ways, what Google and Facebook have done is they have just sort of taken off the parts of the model that weren't about the relationship between the reader and the content. And I think there are a lot of ways that are very heartening. So, for example, the fact that in China, WePay off of WeChat, the social media engine, enables micropayments may forecast a future in which micropayments work in the US, because right now they don't work because of credit card transaction fees. So, that's one example. Another example is the fact that the democratization of the distribution tools, which are in part Facebook and Google, but I'm thinking about things like Substack, which is an email newsletter startup, enables individual journalists to sell content directly. So there's a lot of unbundling that's happening. Part of the unbundling happened in that classifieds and display advertising don't support traditional legacy media organizations anymore. And some of that is just legacy print, but some of that is legacy broadcast. But also that there are these new tools that enable new business models. And I think in the same way that Debbie sees a lot of students who are really passionate and excited about doing investigative work today, the students I see that are interested in media strategy are incredibly excited because they believe that they don't need to buy a printing press or get a radio license or a broadcast license to be able to do journalism. So I think there are lots of difficulties, and I don't mean to downplay those. And I think legacy organizations are under tremendous pressure. But our students are often fairly positive about the fact that they can go out and do journalism on their own without any of the historic support, but also challenges.
Can they make a living at it?
I mean, I will say there's a history professor up in Maine who's making $1 million a year on her Substack email newsletter alone. And that not a Medill grad, but a Kellogg grad, Ben Thompson, who runs the Stratechery blog, supposedly makes hundreds of thousands of dollars. That's what he self-reports on his email newsletter. So there are examples. Would it work for everyone? Probably not. But there certainly is more opportunity to start something than there ever was before.
So does that mean we in Medill, and I think we are there, but I'm curious to hear what you folks think, need to, when I was coming out of Medill, it was all about, starting in a small newspaper, working your way up, blah, blah, blah. That model is broken. Do we need to talk to our students about the entrepreneurial world that they are going to enter and that they are not going to, they may not necessarily be employees, but they are going to sort of brand themselves, if you will, Danielle, and hang their shingle and make it on their own?
I would just say that I think we need to flip that question. Okay. It's not a question of do we need to tell our students, it's will our students keep coming to Medill if we don't? Yeah. I had a student who is already an entrepreneur who started not in spite of the curriculum at Medill, but certainly on his own without a lot of support, a media-oriented business. And what he said is, he had almost graduated from Medill without having had a chance to talk about media business models. And the irony is people like you, people like Chris, people like me, people like Tim have lots of experience there, but historically that didn't feel as much part of the curriculum because when our students were graduating, it would be years, if not decades, before they needed to understand how a media company worked as a business. And I think that's changed a lot. I think we are now in a place not only where people are their own brands, and Danielle is much better qualified to talk about that than I am, but where people are very often going to be their own company. And so they certainly need education that way.
Is that as true on the IMC side, Danielle? We don't talk as much about the digital disruption there, but there certainly has been equal disruption on the IMC, on the advertising side. Those agency work is not what it used to be when you came out of school either. It's a whole different world. And so how are we talking to those students?
It absolutely.
You're a young person, I should say. You haven't been out of school that long. So.
No, it absolutely has changed. I started my career out of Medill in ad agencies, and even just long before there was this break off of the creative agency and the media agency, and then the digital agencies and what have you. This idea of branding and personal branding and entrepreneurship, where I think that starts for, especially on the IMC side, honestly, I think we can be, and I hope to do a better job of bringing those examples into the curriculum and into the coursework. We have a faculty that has done a lot of amazing things in industry. but I think that if we were to, just put a little more, more effort, be more intentional about, when we talk about advertising, when we talk about branding, when we talk about communications, when we talk about data foundations, right? 3 things I think Medill does very well: audience, voice, and data, right? Whether you're journalism or IMC, right? And have all the permission in the world to own those 3 lanes, right? And to the extent that we can identify, how audience, voice, and data plays out in not just large global, organizations, but also startups, also the innovation pipeline, also when we think about product design development, when we think about diverse-led companies, right? Small businesses, so many things that we can pull into and model, take as a model and bring it to the classroom, that I think will open the minds of students as to, oh, okay, it happened in this way in this industry, and make it real for them. But it's absolutely happening on the marketing side of things. I think we just need to just drum it up a little bit more, especially when it comes to innovation.
Chris, oh, go ahead, Chris.
I was going to say, like what they said. I concur. But I think, your original question is, should we be involved, intentionally in guiding students with respect to these alternate paths? And I think it's profitable both for them and for us. And I've seen a few students who have started their own blogs and been able to use those to market themselves, and they wind up, in other positions. One is a student I had at Illinois, Taylor Rooks, who's really blowing up now. She had a blog she was sharing with me while she was a student of mine in sports, and now she's in New York doing all kinds of crazy things. Ezra Klein, actually, in some ways, is an example of this too, with Vox, and now look at where he is. But obviously, he brought a lot to that and a lot of experience. But you get the point. I think that we need to look more at this whole notion of entrepreneurial journalism. And the reason I say we gain from it is because we ensure that people who are out there who are probably going to be doing this anyway have the skills and the values of journalism, so that we can make sure that they're doing it right.
And I wanted to hark back on something that you talked about a little earlier, Chris, and that was kind of media literacy. Because I also say it's not only is it enough for us to train our students, but we have to sort of train the public to be more discerning consumers of media. And again, where does that fit, both in our curriculum, but also in our outreach? Chris.
Well, in terms of outreach, as you know, I've been talking increasingly about programmatic initiatives that would address that. So part of that would be more public engagement, more of our programming efforts, if you will, public speaking, framing the discourse on media to show the public how we are approaching this and how they need to read media, whether it's a traditional newspaper, if they're looking at television, which is, according to the research, where most people are still getting their information. Social media is trending, but how do you discern among all these sources what is of value in making enlightened choices, not just informed choices? You could watch, just random example here, I don't know, Fox News, and have information. The issue is going to be, is it going to be an informed decision? I mean, an enlightened decision that you make ultimately. But I think also more locally, we stand to gain a lot, I think, from educating our peers on the campus of the value, the centrality, if you will, of journalism in a democratic society. I don't know that enough of our colleagues, as enlightened as they might be, as celebrated scholars as they might be, really appreciate what it is we do. After all, if you think about the titles of our degrees, they have science in them, right? So I think we need to do a lot to elevate the consciousness of our peers as well.
Yeah, I actually think that we should have a class that's required for all students in Northwestern in media literacy. Frankly, I think that's certainly a service we could pay to the institution. Tell me, each of you, kind of, oh, go ahead, Jim.
Charles, I agree with you about that, and also concur with what Chris was saying about news literacy. And I think, yes, we can speak, we can write about it, we can inject it in our curriculum. But we can also go down to the grassroots level, and we're actually doing that now through a new program called Metro Media Lab, which has a component called Teach for Chicago Journalism. And we're now working with the News Literacy Project, which is this great nonprofit started by Alan Miller, a prize-winning investigative reporter. And we're going to be teaching journalism advisors to teach their students in Chicago high schools, Chicago area high schools, about news literacy. And in conversations with these advisors, I can tell you that this is the #1 issue that they're talking about, because their students just see all this chatter and information on TikTok or Instagram, or well, students not so much on Facebook. And it all just gets intermingled. You know, it's hard to tell what's real and what isn't in the news feed. And so I think we can even reach beyond our campus, and are reaching beyond our campus, to have an impact on news literacy down to the high school level. So by the time they get to Northwestern, hopefully they have a better understanding.
I think that's absolutely right. I think, yeah, regardless of whether they decide to go into journalism, I think that's a service we can provide. Yeah. Tell me, each of you, kind of what you're excited about in terms of what you're working on, either in the classroom or out. Yeah, and what's on the horizon for you, Debbie? What excites you these days?
Well, I thought this year would be a little bit slower than last year, but we took off running in January with another group of investigative lab students. 4 of my students are embedded with my colleagues at the Washington Post right now, working on very important stories for this year. We had an unprecedented interest in this program. I know this sounds simplistic, but I always say the best way to learn journalism is to do journalism. And in this lab, students work directly with me from story conception all the way through to fact checking and publication. In fact, one of my students published a story yesterday in the Washington Post because 5 US senators have proposed legislation to shore up patient safety protocols in nursing homes. Yeah. And that's the kind of impact that, you know, really means a lot, you know, to young journalists, to see that words matter and that investigative stories can bring about positive changes in some ways, in many ways. And so we took off running. We're writing about white nationalism and extremism this year. We've already had interest from my editors at the Washington Post to publish a couple of big stories. And I'm already getting questions from students about what we're doing this summer, and are we going to expand again and extend again into the summer? And the answer is yes, hopefully we will do that because we just only have a certain number of seats and a lot of students want to be involved. So super excited about the work we're doing.
Danielle, what about you? What are you excited about?
So just earlier this quarter, myself along with Nancy Hobart got together and relaunched the Thought Leadership portal for IMC. And so working with a group of students to bring the thinking that is you know, so rich among what we do in IMC, you know, putting that into articles and bringing that forward. I think there's a link in the chat to the portal, which lives on LinkedIn. But it's this wonderful marriage of not only the thinking and the thought leadership coming from the students, but the students are tapping into speakers who come to class and topics that are, you know, important to them. And then we work with some journalism students to help actually put the thing out, right? So I'm excited that is now being relaunched and looking forward to it, you know, growing and gaining some traction. So definitely check it out.
Thanks. Jeremy?
One of the things that I'm most excited about is we in the Night Lab, and really as part of a collaboration across Northwestern involving computer science and communications and several other schools, are looking at different ways that artificial intelligence can benefit and impact journalism. And we're not just looking at that in the lab and thinking about it in an academic context, but really in a very applied way. So there's two different programs that I think we'll be involved in over the next year or two. One is looking at the role that artificial intelligence can play in investigative journalism, and we'll really be concentrating on South and Central America, maybe Mexico as well. And another is looking at the impact of artificial intelligence on business sustainability for local newsrooms in the United States. And in both cases, what the Knight Lab will really do is help guide the process of understanding what the needs really are, and then helping to prototype technology that will actually be field tested. So we won't just know theoretically whether it works, we'll actually see positive outcomes, stories that are created, improved revenue pictures. And so that I'm really excited about, especially because of the collaboration.
Cool. Tim.
Yes, so I mentioned the Metro Media Lab project, and one element of the Metro Media Lab is a media management program. And one of the goals of this is to help bolster the local news ecosystem in our own backyard, right here in Chicago. And so we've now pulled together our first cohort of independent local news organizations in Chicago. And they are opening the gates to us. We are going to be going in and working with them on everything from audience analytics, which again, we can do uniquely well, to strategy, to helping to manage this new landscape, this new business model that's emerging to help them grow, to help them understand how to better connect with citizens in Chicago, and help make them more informed voters and more engaged people in our community. And so I'm just really excited about this. And I might say too that so are the news organizations. You know, they respect Medill, they respect the people who work here, and they want our help. And in fact, they're clamoring for it in some ways. So this is one of those really unique moments where, you know, we're going to be able to get our hands dirty, connect with news organizations that are connected with the community. And we're also going to have faculty and students engaged in this project as well, including the Knight Lab, Jeremy, as well. So there are going to be lots of components, parts of Medill that are going to be working on this really important initiative that we have going.
Chris, you're muted.
Sorry about that. So yeah, a couple of things. Within Medill, we've been talking about bringing together faculty who have special offerings in different areas of social construction and media responsibility. So we have I think an excellent representation of faculty members who specialize in First Nations, sexuality, gender, race, and on, immigration, and to bring us together in conversation so that we can begin to build programmatic initiatives that not only enhance what we're doing within Medill, but also can reach out and help to guide our colleagues in the field, but also campus-wide. And I'd love to have further conversations with you and Tim, even about the campus-wide curriculum on media literacy. I've talked to Beth Bennett, our Associate Dean, about that as well. I'm also writing, so I front-loaded my teaching, which is killing me, but to create space to complete a couple of, several writing projects. One is a graphic novel on Emmett Till and the writer's story. Second is a more in-depth piece on Emmett Till, along with his cousin and best friend who was at the house the night of terror when Emmett was taken away. His 66-year journey of traumatic memory, but we're paralleling that with something of a ride along with the FBI as it concludes its investigation. So the TikTok is, you know, the investigation itself, which we're tracking through his lived experience. So it's quite a compelling piece. We already have a contract. So yeah, there's that. And then I want to read Debbie's book. So that's on my agenda as well. And as she knows, we talked about it when she first came here. I'm working on a Holocaust project, play with a friend of mine who is the founding executive director of the Shoah Foundation, who mined the oral histories of Shoah for several documentaries. They've all been award-winning. I'm turning one into a play with his guidance. So there's that as well.
Great, thank you. There are a couple of questions in the Q&A. I tried to get to a lot of them during the course of our conversation. There are others that I didn't quite get to, so I'm going to try to see if you want to take some of these on now. One is from a high school junior, an aspiring sports journalist, and this might be for Jeremy and Tim, who says, do you see the possibility of Twitch overtaking cable TV as a source of news and information? Jeremy.
Absolutely, but I don't think it's going to be Twitch alone. I think what Twitch has shown is the power of live streaming. And it would stun me if Facebook and Google, particularly YouTube, don't adapt enough to have more compelling options here. I think just in case there's anyone in the audience not old enough to really know about Twitch, what Twitch is really all about is turning on the video camera or the recording device while you're often showcasing something else. So you could be watching television, you could be playing video games. What we did at the Post that was really powerful with Twitch is layer on top of video like C-SPAN style, here's coverage of a government hearing, here's coverage of another live event, and then add in a level of expertise. But what really works on Twitch is a conversational relationship. And so I don't know if Tim feels this way, but certainly as a sports fan, over time, you probably adapted to all the ways that you had conversation around the game. We can remember a time that could happen in person, but you could go to a corner bar, you could talk with friends, you could text. Well, the next version of that is essentially being part of a conversation while someone is streaming. So especially for sports journalism, streaming is incredibly, incredibly important.
Tim, any thoughts?
No, I agree with everything Jeremy said. I mean, Twitter, I watch sports and I'm on Twitter, so I can watch the conversation on Twitter and argue back and forth with folks on Twitter about coaches' decisions and referees' calls and things like that. But Twitch, I think, is the next frontier that really kind of integrates that commentary with the video, which is great.
There's another question. We haven't talked much here about foreign affairs and national security and military defense journalism, only because we just happen to have assembled a panel in which that is not where the expertise is necessarily, though we do have faculty. And I will say this is from a question of a very good friend of the school, Marvin Ott. I will say to Marvin, Medill in the past 7 years has expanded its global footprint tremendously. When we were traveling, we send almost all of we suspend the graduate program for 1 quarter and send almost all of the graduate students around the world to do international reporting. We now send about half of the undergraduates on a global trip as well, all in an effort. We were a school that was rooted in kind of local regional journalism. I would say that is not the case so much anymore. Again, we have spread across the country, again, with a campus in San Francisco, campus in DC, which we've had for more than 50 years. But again, we are also, we have our partners in Doha, Qatar, but we are also, again, fanning out and sending students to make sure that students have a global perspective and they don't have a very narrow domestic perspective. And we have also had specializations in the graduate program in national security and defense as well. So I will take that. And another good friend of the school, Willie Weinbaum, asks, is copy editing taught in the school? And that's a really controversial question, Willie. Yes, it is taught, but not in the way Willie and I are contemporaries, not in the way in which it was taught when we were students. There was a dedicated copy editing class then, and it was brutal, but we all survived it. We do not. Yeah, Jeremy and Danielle, you probably survived it as well, now that I think about it.
Barely.
Yes. We now teach copy editing within the context of the skills classes. It is not a dedicated class. And Willie, I can argue, we can have conversations offline about whether or not that is the most effective way to teach copy editing, but I will not bore the rest of the world. But to answer your question, yes, we do teach it, but we are teaching it differently today. Chris, did you want to add something?
No, I accidentally unmuted, sorry.
Yes. And let's see, there was one other question. For you, Tim, someone asks whether JOAs or joint operating agreements will be a cure to the loss of local newspapers? Is that a way to save many of these? I know my thoughts on this, and I think I know yours as well, but I will let you, I'll let you answer.
Yeah, I think, you know, JOAs go back to the 1970s, really, and, you know, helped solve a problem in some ways with printing of newspapers.
You could explain what those are for people who may not be familiar with them.
Joint operating agreements. So for example, in Detroit, you know, you could join forces in printing and in some ways producing the newspapers with two newspapers, coming up with more efficiencies and better ways to both print and produce the newspapers. I will say that I think what we're seeing now are more partnerships among local news outlets in a market. But before, especially in Chicago, there was this just you know, death to the death competition between the Tribune and the Sun-Times, and you'd throw the other newspapers in the Chicago River and you know, trash news boxes. There was all sorts of stuff that went on back in the day. Now those competitive juices have turned to collaboration in many ways, as the market is splintered in a million different directions. So I think we will see more partnerships between nonprofits and legacy organizations, and between startups and legacy organizations. So they're not JOAs per se, but they are basically collaborations among local news organizations. So it's a long way of saying yes.
Well, I think that's a long way of saying no.
Kind of.
That's something that kind of resembles what JOAs were, but not necessarily JOAs.
Right.
Because again, I think the JOA model is dead. But you're right. I think there will be collaboration. I think there was more cooperation and collaboration than there was. And Chris, someone wants to know when your Holocaust survivor themed play will be finished and performed, and where will it be performed?
Thank you.
No pressure.
Yeah, I know. It's like, well, we've done a reading down at the Krannert Center at the University of Illinois, where they workshopped Moises Kaufman's 33 Variations. So I felt this was a great environment. We had Chuck Smith from the Goodman who directed the reading, so he still wants to be involved. We're going to take it through more workshopping to put it on stage eventually. We were going to do it this year, but obviously we can't now. So we'll see. But I have a draft. I think probably one more polish. But the thing I've learned about dramatic writing, because I had never done this before, is that it's never finished. And but we will mount it at some point. My hope is within the next year. And it's quite a compelling story. I didn't say enough about that. It's a story that grows out of the Schindler's List story. And James Maul, the person who has partnered up with me, the person who is a Spielberg protege actually, was able to find a woman who was featured in the Schindler's List movie, the young woman who is enslaved by the crazy commandant who lives in the basement. And he put her in conversation with the commandant's daughter. So you can imagine the kind of compelling, dramatic piece this is developing as. And I use it to tying into something that Debbie said, because I'm going to turn this back on y'all, about looking at the 50 obits across the states. And that's one of the things that I think is of great value in the way we're practicing journalism, and that's looking at the intimate story and using that intimate story to present value-added impact. And that is the context of it. So in those individual obits, we get the largest story of tremendous loss in our society. By the same token, my hope is that we can have this conversation that grows out of these two women who each, frankly, have a traumatic memory, obviously one much more severe. That we can communicate something really important about the Holocaust, particularly at this moment when we have so many people denying.
Sounds fascinating. We look forward to seeing it.
No pressure.
No pressure. That's right. Colleagues, thank you so much. I have so enjoyed speaking with you. I could spend a couple more hours talking to you, but I will release our guests here. It was very kind of you to share your thoughts, your expertise with me and with the audience. As Chris said, I missed the corridor conversation, sort of bumping into one another, since we're all kind of, connecting from our home offices. But one day we will be back together again. Thank you to those of you who were able to join us for the webinar. We really appreciate it. Take care, everyone, and have a good evening.